Hi, hello, and welcome back. The science is process and perspective. So this lecture is a bit unusual. There's no questions. I'm just going to sort of dive into a few aspects of biology to give you an example of how you can use process thinking very productively in research. So this is sort of an example that is supposed to show how you can do biology differently by a change in philosophical perspective. So the philosophy that we're covering here is not just important for understanding science as a whole. This is very important. And the next two lectures will focus on that again. But in this lecture, we're focusing on how thinking in philosophical ways, changing perspectives, seeing those perspectives is important for your own research, perhaps, even if you're not a biologist. I could have chosen many different examples from many different disciplines, from physics to the social sciences, and shown how sort of thinking with a process perspective can make you see things differently. But because I'm a biologist, I'm going to use a pretty general example from biology itself. So this should be understandable by anyone, even if you're not a biologist. And it's sort of an illustration of this very basic point that I made last time, that Western philosophy and with it the scientific worldview adhere to a largely substance or object-based worldview philosophy. That substance is fundamental and processes are epiphenomena or derived properties of things. We're always asking first, what is the thing made of? Not really how does it work? And that you run into these problems of agency, that things need to do stuff, and that this is a fundamental aspect of their being, but it's not trivial to explain how things actually do stuff. And if a thing, that's what I pointed out last time, if a thing doesn't do anything, then it doesn't even exist because it cannot even be perceived or measured or derived in any sort of way. And if it doesn't have any, if it doesn't enter into any sort of relationships, it does not exist, basically. And I was also already pointing out with this biological example how this sort of problem can get you into trouble when you're trying to explain, for example, human behavior, a very complex trait, by reductionist sort of explanations, some sort of sequence on a DNA causing some sort of, not just the behavior in this case, but a fundamental aspect of a person's, of a human being's personality. That is really difficult. It's really difficult to bridge the gap between a DNA sequence that makes a protein to this sort of really big claim that it's causing some sort of specific behavioral behaviors or behavioral patterns. Okay. In recent times, of course, we have made great progress, and we have no longer sort of these very simplistic single gene explanations, but we explain biological phenomena like this. Okay, so this is not a sort of a radio circuit or a computer chip. This is a gene network that's used to explain the early development of a marine animal, a sea urchin. And you have different sort of nodes in this network. They're genes, and they make proteins that bind to the DNA and switch on or off other genes. So basically, uh, the development of a complex animal is seen as a bunch of switches between such genes, and the different boxes in this diagram tell you when and where in the embryo these genes are switching each other on and off. And the arrows, of course, between those genes are describing how they regulate each other, if they switch each other on or off, if they're connected in the first place, and so on and so forth. So there's a huge sort of step forward from this simple view of one switch for a behavior that we saw before to lots of switches from a behavior, but it still suffers from the same problem, and that is this network, this depiction of a network is a thing, and the phenomena it is supposed to explain is a process. And it's really not clear from just staring at this network, or even from following through, thinking, trying to mentally simulate it, trying to think it through. It's not clear how you get one from the other. So there's still this huge gap between the thing we postulate as the source of a phenomenon and the phenomenon itself. So in this sense, this is not an explanation. And of course, and many biologists have forgotten that this is not an organism. Okay, so organisms aren't networks. Organisms are processes. And these networks are sort of a snapshot, an abstraction used to describe the organization, the structure of these processes. But that's it. They're abstract models. They're not they're not representing these sort of this particular depiction here is called a hairball graph. That's a technical term in systems biology. It looks like something a bird of prey pukes up after it has eaten a mouse or any other little rodent. So this is not uh, an explanation for a process, but we're stuck with this sort of we need things, to think, and so people often don't question these sort of presentations. You're shown some sort of complex diagram, a bunch of shapes connected by lines, and mostly accompanied by some impressive words, and then you're just terribly impressed, but you don't understand anything really. And only by asking these philosophical questions, taking a different perspective from people in your field, if you're in one of these fields where these sort of modes of explaining, so to say, in scare quotes, are dominant, only by stepping out of that and sort of questioning yourself, reflecting on what you're doing, will you see the problems with those kind of explanations. So what we're using here, we're using philosophy to get to better questions, to better explanations in biology. Okay, so this requires, to get beyond this problem, requires a more philosophical biology. And this is quite astonishing if you think about it. There's no other subject where processes, the idea that processes are fundamental, are so clear and obvious. So the foundational theory of all of biology is evolutionary theory. There's a picture of Darwin and his first sketch 30 years before he actually published his book. In his notebook he wrote, I think, and you have this branching patterns that describes the process of phylogenesis, the generation of new lineages, species in evolution. That's one sort of time scale. I was telling you before, you can distinguish processes by their time scale. You can look at a much shorter time scale, not across generations, but within a generation, and you get development, the process of ontogenesis, which is sort of the sum of all metabolic, physiological, and developmental processes that make up the life cycle of an organism. And if you put those two together, you realize that evolution is sort of a process of processes. It's sort of, the phylogenesis of ontogenesis, the evolution of development in a very broad sense. And so it's an amazing, I've depicted it as this sort of curly line here, processes of, evolving cycles. And when we do evolutionary biology, we often just take these snapshots from generation to generation. We look at the frequency of different genes. And when we look at development, we often have these simplistic genetic explanations where we just have a list of genes saying these genes are causing this trait, and that's it. And as I told you before, this leaves a huge gap between the sort of entity that we postulate as a source of a phenomenon and the phenomenon itself. This is a really big problem. Okay, so how do we get past this sort of thinking in biology? It's really hard, and so it's interesting not just to look at philosophy, but always that looking at the history of where this current view came from. And the current state of reductionist biology goes all the way back to René Descartes, actually, and this sort of idea that he introduced to the world for the first time ever a few hundred years ago, that human body is indistinguishable from a perfectly designed automaton, he writes in the Treatise of Man. He then writes in the description of the human body, which is a book that he wrote, this description of this automata amounts to an explanation of the organism. So basically just take the parts apart. This is very important at the time. And without it, we would still be sort of stuck. But of course, it cannot explain an organism. A much better sort of mechanistic metaphor comes from Julien Offray de la Métrie, who famously said, the human body is a machine which winds its own springs. So like a clock that winds itself up. It is the living image of perpetual movement. Here's the mystery. There is a lot that goes into this activity of winding up your own springs. That's where the whole mystery of life comes from. We know now that the sort of way that these springs must be organized are very non-machine-like. We'll come back to that in a second. But basically, if you want to explain the difference between living and non-living systems, this is exactly what you need to describe. How can a system wind its own springs? Cannot be a perpetuum mobile. It's still subject to the laws of thermodynamics, and yet it can sort of self-produce. And this is the core of what it means to explain not just what life is, but also, and that's very important, the agency of organisms. Organisms do stuff, they act, and most importantly, they have goals that they pursue. That's what agency means. You are doing something for some purpose. And those are questions that we do not even ask anymore in biology because we've been completely restricting ourselves through a mechanistic view of biology. We consider organisms machines. And this has, from Alfredo Lametri, it goes to the sort of 19th century view of life, or maybe 18th century view of life as a sort of a steam engine, a thermodynamic machine, to this sort of early 20th century view of the human body as a chemical factory. And so the metaphors, machine metaphors we use for life, they change through history. But what doesn't change is this idea that you can, if a living being is a machine, you can dissect it into different parts. I mean, the chemical factory metaphor is already better than the mechanical machines, of course. But still, you can dissect it in certain parts, analyze those parts in isolation, and understand how the whole machine is put together. And today, of course, we have a biology dominated by computer metaphors. When we say genes code for something, there's a genetic program, and so on and so forth. And so, as famous evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin, one of my big scientific heroes, as he points out, the metaphor of all modern science, the machine model that we owe to Descartes, has actually ceased to be a metaphor and has become the unquestioned reality. Organisms are no longer like machines, they are machines. So the map here clearly has become the territory. And we're not taking the phenomena serious anymore because we're so stuck in this map. It's like if you explore a city and you only look at your tourist guide of it, the pictures in the tourist guide. You don't look at the real thing anymore. That's what happened to biology. And so biology is firmly stuck in this sort of, and to get out of it right now, the big challenges in biology, we have tons of technology, tons of data, machines that go ping and that sequence everything you want. But we have lost the big questions. We have forgotten, to look at the forest for all the trees that we have. And we have so many trees that we can look at trees for the rest of our lifetimes. There's always something more to do. There's always a new technology that springs up. And so what we actually need in biology very urgently, and also in other branches of science, is a sort of a rethinking of what we're actually doing. Fundamental thinking of our concepts. And that requires philosophy. As I said very early on in this lecture series, philosophy will never be swallowed by science because it is not science. And in fact, science urgently needs philosophy to get out of the sort of traps it has built for itself at the moment. So how, this is a very dominant metaphor, okay? So not just in developmental biology, also in evolution, do we use these sort of machine metaphors of optimal design, natural selection optimizes organisms? No, it doesn't. This concept of satisficing is very important in evolution as well. Just like scientific knowledge evolves to satisfy, to just be good enough, organisms evolve to just be good enough, okay? They don't evolve to be optimal. And also this idea of the genetic program, which is pervasive and completely poisonous and toxic. It does not exist. It's a metaphor that has outlived its usefulness. There are no instructions. There are no genetic algorithms in biology, they're there in computer science, and there is no hardware-software distinction. So this is a metaphor that is impeding progress and clear thinking about the organization of living beings at the moment. But still, it's like it's one of these zombies, like rational choice theory, that just lives on. So here is Stevenbrenner, recently deceased, unfortunately, a fantastic biologist, but he was pushing this idea of the cell as a factory of molecular machines. There's a very good criticism of that. Too, that I haven't listed here yet by Dan Nicholson. This is, by the way, work based on work by philosopher of biology Dan Nicholson. And this sort of machine view is very dominant in current synthetic biology, where we try to engineer biological organisms that are, unlike machines, like they were machines. And, people are running into a lot of problems because of that and are surprised because they have not been taught to think philosophically about these problems. So we need philosophy to get out of this corner. This was recognized a long time ago, 1976, here in Fragmentation and Wholeness. Physicist David Bowman tells us, and it's always embarrassing if a physicist tells you what's wrong with biology, but he is absolutely right here. So he tells us, modern molecular biologists generally believe that the whole of life and mind can ultimately be understood in more or less mechanical terms. Thus, we arrive at the very odd result that in the study of life and mind, which are just the fields in which formative cause, acting in undivided and unbroken flowing movement, is most evident to experience and observation. There is now the strongest belief in the fragmentary atomistic approach to reality. It's paradox. Again, we're ignoring our experience. If we would actually be paying attention to living organisms, we would immediately see ecosystems as well, that they're not machine-like at all. And we need a better understanding. Machines are complicated. Nature is complex. And complicated ways of explaining complex systems always fail because they're fragile. They're not robust and they don't understand. They pretend to be able to predict, but they don't. So how is this? It's possible that this is, is the dominant view. There is, again, just like in philosophy, there is sort of a tradition of process biologists that has endured through history, but it starts with a whole group of people that are missing here. They were sort of between philosophy and biology, the organicists of the 1920s and the 30s. I should put them on the slide. This was a very sort of dominant way of thinking, theoretical thinking about organisms at the time. And they were postulating that organisms are not, there's no vitalism, there's no vital force, but organisms are not like machines. Sort of influenced by this movement was the most famous process biologist, that I know, Conrad Howell Waddington. Wonderful book, The Strategy of the Genes. So he was postulating his famous sort of landscape. I'm showing you a rather unusual animation of his landscape here, just to show you how it moves. And the idea was that there is some sort of what he called an epigenetic landscape. And when an organism develops, it's like it sort of flows down the valleys of this landscape, which determines the fates of its different components. And evolution is changing the topography, the shape of this landscape. And you can see the genes here at the bottom, these pegs are connected to the topography of the landscape through this spider web of ropes that are influencing indirectly, you see, in a very complex way, how this landscape is shaped. His ideas were formalized by French mathematician René Thom with his catastrophe theory that inspired Salvador Dali to paint his last painting. And so that catastrophe theory never caught on, but that was a very process-oriented general theory of biology. That's probably why it failed. It was a bit too general and abstract to catch on and to connect to experimental biologists. But beautiful, beautiful work and very inspiring, as you can see with the example of the beautiful Dali painting here. And you have more modern representatives of very process-oriented approaches. The most famous probably is Stuart Kauffman. His book, The Origin of Order, is a classic in the field. And for example, the movement of the process structuralists, my own master supervisor, Brian Goodwin, and people like George Oster, who just recently died, and Pera Alberg, who were pioneering dynamical systems approaches to the evolution of developmental systems in the 1970s. Very important people, very marginalized. Again, everybody was sort of sequencing stuff and, looking, first of all, cloning the genes that are responsible, parts lists, parts lists, parts lists. You clone a gene that is involved in creating a sort of a phenotype, a trait of an organism, and you list those genes, and then after you've cloned all the genes, you sequence them, of course, and everything is sort of explained by DNA sequences without explaining the big gap between those sequences and what's actually happening in the organism. So you can take this further, actually, and I just want to mention this briefly. We've already talked about Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of the organism in last lecture. But you can actually make the claim that, it's not sort of physics that explains the universe, but you need biology. So basically, when life comes into the universe, the rules of the universe have fundamentally changed. And so to explain the world, you need to include biology as a fundamental aspect of reality. There's no fundamental distinction between organic and inorganic matter. That's sort of an arbitrary distinction we impose. And in Whitehead's view, because he sees the whole universe as more organism-like than clock-like, he says, the principles of biology are actually more fundamental than physics. And that, of course, jibes kind of well with the idea that Bill Wimsatt has, that you can explain, nowadays we would probably not say more fundamental, because in Wimsatt's view, you have different levels, and all those levels are important. So I wouldn't say more fundamental than physics, although Whitehead claimed it, but they're both equally important to explain the world. And also the social sciences have an equally fundamental contribution to make to our understanding of our world, our place in that physical world. It not only requires you to understand your relationship with the rest of the dead, physical, inanimate world, but also your relationship with other living beings, human beings, and of course, your relationship with yourself, which is much more complicated. So it's impossible, it's impossible to reduce all of this to physics, okay? And the special sciences have very important contributions to make. And he's talking about perception as fundamental, being in the world, okay? So these actual occasions that he's talking about, these events of they're experiential events, okay? A very rich sort of world that bridges the relationship between the subjective and the objective. He was one of the last big metaphysicians coming up with a really, really coherent view of the universe. And so that compels you to look at biology, not just look at living organisms in a different way, not just to focus agency of organisms, the openness of evolution as important questions, but to look at the whole world and biology, the living in that world in a completely different way. Much more organic, much more holistic, much more open, much more process-oriented. The last example I want to use here is Susanne Langer, as a philosopher of biology, who wrote this wonderful book, Mind, an Essay on Human Feeling, where she builds up a sort of a process view of biology that is based on living systems as composed of acts. So everything is fundamentally an activity. So these are temporally drawn out living processes. They implement different activities. An organism is built up by its own acts. And again, genes don't act, but organisms are processual entities. They are made of different interacting processes. They're open to their environment. They act. They have goals. They pursue those goals. So biology, Langer said, should be the analysis of processes in terms of their temporal structure. Okay, so not parts lists, not these sort of relational diagrams that are static, these network diagrams, but an actual processual explanation. Okay, so if you take that serious, how do you go about biology? That is a very difficult question. And here's some beautiful work by Dan Nicholson, whose work I've already cited before in this lecture, but who I'm showing you here with a picture now. And that is sort of an alternative to this machine conception. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get away. We need to have another metaphor, a better metaphor, to be able to talk about processes in biology. That's often the first step. Okay, metaphors are at the beginning of conceptual innovation. And so it's difficult to talk about processes, and we need to, talk about processes in biology in a different way. We need to step out of this machine metaphor into what he calls the stream of life conception of the organism. So living forms are not in being, but they are happening. They are the expression of a perpetual stream of matter and energy, which passes the organism and at the same time constitutes it. So the processes that make up the organisms, they are the organism. So here's a stream as a metaphor, but that's still, I think the better metaphor again is sort of the flame, although that's also still limited because it doesn't have these sort of self-making, autopoietic, self-reproducing properties necessarily that living organisms have. So Nicholson draws three lessons from that sort of switch of metaphor, switch of perspective. One is that to be is to act. Activity is a necessary condition for existence. So we have to pay much more attention to activities that, constitute living beings, that living beings are involved in if we want to understand development, evolution, if we want to understand biology. The identity of organisms, if we ask ourselves, what is it to be me? Who am I? The identity of you and any other organism is grounded in continuous self-maintenance of forms. So it's a diachronic identity, which means it's extended over time. What we really need to explain is how you can change all the time while remain the same. And again, David Hume already asked this question when he sort of looked into himself and he said, there is no self, there's only a bunch of thoughts. And then 5 minutes later, there's a different bunch of thoughts. And 20 years later, there's a completely different bunch of thoughts. So he concluded there is no self, there's just a bunch of thoughts. But of course, he thought of the self as a thing, and it's much more productive to think of the self, of the identity of the organism as a processual phenomenon extended through time. That's what diachronic means. And then the third sort of lesson to draw from this all is order does not entail design. So self-modifying dynamic organization is everywhere in biology, but there is no design in the sense that there is nothing imposed, no form is imposed on the matter. Everything is arising in a self-organizing way. And so if you take that to an extreme, then you get to this sort of self-repairing, self-producing, self-reproducing nature of the organism, which lies at the heart of its agency and makes it fundamentally different from a machine. So by recognizing these sort of lessons, we will finally be able to make progress in biology. And so to conclude, he says the crucial point is that if we want an ontology of life, remember ontology is sort of a branch of philosophy that's busy with what really is, what exists. If we want an ontology of life that is grounded and informed by natural science, then a processual account seems unavoidable. Whatever else organisms may be, what cannot be denied at an ontological level is that they are stable metabolic flows of energy and matter. And this is how process philosophy is directly important. We need a biology in the 21st century that is explicitly based on taking this perspective serious. You don't have to completely switch or be convinced by it, but at least be serious about it. Because a lot of the questions that we could ask haven't even been asked. And a lot of the approaches that we have that seem to be process-based and dynamic, like dynamical systems theory, they are directly imported from physics, and they're not really dynamic in the sense that they should be to explain the nature of living systems. So these questions that come out of switching your perspective, they are not even unanswered. They're not only unanswered, but they're not even asked. And so by thinking about biology in this philosophical way, you can ask entirely new questions. And if more and more people will do this, we will develop completely new research approaches, methodologies, technologies that do this kind of thinking justice. So there must be an interplay between the sort of technology-based approaches, what is feasible, and the philosophical approaches, what is important. And we've completely lost track of what's important in biology. We've only followed the technology, and we've driven ourselves into a corner, into an intellectual monoculture where different perspectives are no longer accepted or needed as part of what people consider proper biology. And this is impeding the progress of the science. So if you can step out of this, and if you can survive somehow in this absolutely narrow-minded system that we've created nowadays, then you can do truly revolutionary science in biology, in the sense of Thomas Kuhn, so that we will look at the world with different eyes. And I think this is something that we urgently, urgently need, not just in biology, but in society in general. We need a completely different view with different eyes on ourselves and our relationship with the world. So most of the fundamental problem that we're running into right now as humanity, as scientists, have to do with philosophical questions. And I hope that this very general treatment of what is important in biology, very sort of high level, gives you an impression how important it is to think philosophically about the science that you're doing. From that, we will switch back in the next lecture to looking at the process of doing science. There's 2 lectures left in the course. One will look at sort of the individual contributions to the process of doing science. Where do your questions come from? What are your goals? You're a goal-oriented actor in this process of doing science. How do you fit in? What does the philosophy of science have to say about that? And the very last lecture will then look at the societal context in which those actors in science are acting and functioning, and how societal aspects contribute to the dynamics in the process of discovery. But for now, I thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.